just out of curiosity, how many of you would be in favor of a violent revolution to overthrow the government of the United States? In the back there?
I would say so.
Maybe so?
But didn't we
Contemplating
do
the
that?
idea?
It's like,
Didn't we do that? I mean,
We did.
we have to.
But we had a fairly good justification for it at the time, right? We were being taxed to death with no real representation, and the British had taken a very heavy hand with us and decided that they were going to bring us in line with the King's policies. And you had Boston Massacre and Tea Party and some other events that led to the revolution. But ultimately, I think what was clear in that case is that we came out on the other side much better off than had we stayed, under the rule of the crown. So, it just depends. Are there times when a violent revolution may be necessary? I think so. Is that time now in the United States? I don't think so. I think it's definitely not. I think that we ought to be going in the opposite direction to try to right the ship, because if we all get so angry and unhappy with each other that we want to have a violent revolution, remember, there's no foreign country that's controlling us right now that we want to break away from. This would be completely internal. So I don't know what would happen when the dust settled and we're all standing knee deep in the rubble and debris looking at each other like, now what? There's no game plan for what would take the place of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or those sorts of documents. And that speaks in a way to the vacuousness of Marxism. Marxism is a great battle plan. So his doctrines, his ideas, they're very dense, it would take a long time to unpack them and walk through. And this man spent his entire life coming up with these doctrines because he was motivated essentially by one thing and one thing only, and that was he and his partner Engels couldn't wait to bring on the violent revolution. They did everything they possibly could. As I mentioned in the introductory video for this speech, they basically spent their entire lives looking for sparks to pour gasoline on. They wanted a violent revolution. They wanted to overturn everything. They wanted to see it all flipped. And whoever got in the way, carnage be damned, it didn't matter. Whatever it took to get that accomplished, they were going to do it. And thank God they didn't succeed. However, in the future, Marx became idolized, I think largely because of the efforts of his sister and his colleague Engels, who sort of glorified him and took his doctrines. Engels, contributed to those doctrines as well. I think most of Marxism we should probably rightly call Marx-Engelsism, because they both contributed. But I think it's also clear from not only his writings, but also in the personal letters, if you ever get a chance. Some of them are very brief, and it's worth a look. You can find them online. Look at the letters that Marx wrote to his colleague Engels and to his older sister, and look at the letters that his eldest son wrote to him and that his father wrote to him. They refer to him as my dear devil. I mean, this guy is just the personification of evil. And Marx, for the economics part of it, Marx fancied himself an economist and a labor expert, and he was advocating for this overthrow of the current system so that they could usher in socialism. Which it's a little odd to have someone who is a self-declared labor expert who has never worked a single day in his life. He basically came from wealth. He was born to a very, very wealthy family, and then essentially bankrupted his father. His father died, and then he bankrupted his mother, and so then he got married to the rich girl across the street because her parents had more money than his parents did, and then he slowly bankrupted their parents. It was just constantly, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. And he was working on these subversive ideas to put his economic plan out there, and I think that they were not quite aware of what he was up to or what he was hoping for, which was a violent revolution and an overturn of the system. But a man who never punched a clock, never worked a day in his life, he didn't labor or toil one heartbeat in his whole life. This is a labor expert, right? So that should make you suspicious from the beginning. So let me give you a brief overview, and this is a very broad generalization of Marx, but it will help you begin to understand it, I think. things will become clearer after this. But basically, Marx was borrowing from Hegel. Hegel is kind of an eccentric philosopher who looked at things in very complicated ways, and he thought that there would be different ages and different epochs of history and so on and so forth. And so he borrows some of this grandiose language. And basically what Marx does is he says, listen, here's the layout of the land as we know it. You basically have the wealthy people who are oppressing the poor people because they own the means of production, they own the factories. You hear that term, means of production, all the time. They own the factories, they own the machines, and they own all of the materials and the supplies, and they have all the connections. And so that's a type of power. And what they do is they hire us to come, well, not him because he didn't work, but everybody else, the peasantry, as he would have referred to them. They hire the peasantry to come to work, and then they decide to pay them some low wage that's not even enough to live off of. And so whatever it costs to get supplies for their factories, minus whatever it costs to pay the peasantry, there was an excess profit there and excess value generated, just like we do in this country, right? You want to manufacture something for a low price and then sell it for a little bit more, and then you get to keep the leftover money and hope that that might pay your bills in the factory and your workers, and then have a little bit or a lot left over for yourself, and then you can become successful that way. So that's how Marx defined the landscape. Basically, the bourgeois, which were the rich elite people, which is the precise class that he himself came from, were manipulating and controlling everybody else because they owned all the factories, and so nobody had any choice but to go to work for them and to sort of volunteer to be oppressed by them. Now, that's the practical side of the landscape. That's half of it. The other half of it is what he called the superstructure. So I just defined what he would have called the infrastructure. The infrastructure, just like you would imagine here, right? Congress in this country passes infrastructure bills. What does that mean? It means they're going to improve highways, they're going to rebuild things, and they're going to build up the infrastructure, the actual physical components, the factories, the buildings, and everything else. Above that, kind of in the theoretical realm, was what he called the superstructure. And the superstructure maintained order in a similar way. The superstructure referred to the ideological. So the ideological would be, for example, Americanism. As Americans, if we ran into each other on a plane as we were flying over Turkey on the way somewhere on vacation, we realized we were all Americans, we'd probably all start talking to each other and realize what we had in common. We would see each other and we would go, oh, here's a person that knows the value of the First Amendment, and somebody who knows about Betsy Ross and Francis Scott Key and apple pie and George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, could not tell a lie, and all of those tales. Some of them probably aren't true, right? George Washington probably never cut down a cherry tree and then said, I cannot tell a lie. Maybe he did, it doesn't matter. The point is that these are ideological notions. And so to believe in them, whether they're true or not, is what makes us Americans. It's what gives us that mindset. So if we lose that, if we don't have that anymore, if we can't agree on some of the founding principles of the country or some of the ideals, like what does it mean to be an American? If I asked every person in here, you could all tell me, well, here's what I think it means to be an American. And there might be some disagreement, but there would largely be overlap. It's because we have belief systems, right? And it's the belief system that sets the stage for everything else. So remember, you have the infrastructure, which is the actual factories and the roads and the means of production. But then you have the superstructure. And the superstructure, Marx believed, was imposed on society by the wealthy, who had a lock on the ideology. So they could decide what the ideology of the country would be, and by spreading this and getting to people to buy into it and believe it, they were oppressing them, because they were basically fooling you into believing these silly things that weren't really true. And he felt that the peasantry, unless they were German, of course, they didn't really have the wherewithal to figure out that they should revolt and they shouldn't tolerate it because they were just like sheep and went along with it. He had a very cynical view. Considering he wanted those people to rebel and to create a violent revolution, if you read his letters, he had a very, very cynical, nasty view of them too. He certainly didn't have any respect for them. That's one thing that's for sure. Unless they acted out his grand plan. then they became relevant. But if they weren't going to act out his grand plan to have a violent revolution and overturn everything like he thought should be, then they were just stupid peasants. So this is a very cynical person. That superstructure is what he begins to attack in most of his work. And he does so very surreptitiously. You don't even realize it. One minute he's talking about the infrastructure and the property owners and the means of production and the whole notion that you could own property and you could have things and other people couldn't. This is all just a made-up notion. And we should stop agreeing to it, because if you agree to it, you're participating in your own oppression, essentially. And so in talking about the infrastructure, the actual real things, he would very graciously sort of glide into discussions about the superstructure, which was really an encouragement for you to stop believing in those things that made you American or made you German or wherever you lived, that set of ideals, that your belief system. An ideology is a basic set of beliefs. Most of you know this from my classes already, but not everyone. And so it's your most fundamental set of beliefs. We usually see them come in three forms. They're religious, they're political, they're social. There are hybrids of those, and there are many different varieties in there, but those are some big ones. If you believe in a religion, if you're religious yourself, that is an ideology. So for Marx, that would be a superstructure. That's why Marx hates religion, because Marx wanted to impose his own superstructure, a new one, a different one, that would be socialist, but that would eventually evolve to become the perfect ideal communist, where it wouldn't even be necessary for people to exchange money anymore. We would all just go and do those things that we do that make us ourselves, and we would build our own identities through our work, through performing our work and our labor. We would establish who we were through the products of our labor. Money wouldn't even be necessary. The whole world would just work, and it would be happy, and we would all be communist and prosperous somehow. And it's kind of a pipe dream that you would imagine every lazy hippie has. Not to sound like a cynic about that. I know there are some very sweet hippies out there who are well-intended, but it's true. This is a man who never worked a day in his life, and so it looks to me as though he spent the bulk of his life coming up with a grand scheme on how he could flip everything so that nobody really had to work if they didn't want to, and we didn't have money, and everybody would just sort of be equal. And of course, for a guy who didn't want to go to work, that is what your fantasy might look like, a world of communism where nobody has to work, and it's awesome and we should all just do it. The problem is, and I don't know why people say things like, well, it looks good on paper, but in practice it's terrible. No, it doesn't look good on paper. And I also don't understand why people say, well, despite all the flaws and the fact that communism itself was a disaster, Marx has some pretty good criticisms of capitalism. Perhaps you've heard this. Bullshit. No, he doesn't. Show them to me. I've never had anybody bring forth a criticism that he made where I felt like, oh, no, that's a good critique of capitalism. Capitalism is not perfect, that's true. But most of Marx's predictions failed when the Great Depression failed to cause a violent revolution in the United States. It was like, well, why didn't it happen? Why didn't they revolt? What's going on over there? And I think the short answer to that is that the superstructure, if you will, in the United States was a fairly noble one. It was better than a monarchy. It was better than having a tyrant ruler. It was imperfect, and it sure as hell, as everybody knows, wasn't fair to everyone in the beginning, right? But it's tried to right the ship. It's tried to do better. It's vastly improved itself. And for all of the critiques the United States does deserve, in being one of the countries where certainly chattel slavery was prolific, it's also the same country that brought an end to slavery around the world. So I'm not saying that one necessarily cancels out the other, or that we shouldn't have frank and honest conversations about it, because we should, because that's relevant. However, to leave that out of the story, to leave that part out of it, that the United States also went to war with itself, and about 600,000 people died to bring an end to that horrible institution, is rather noteworthy, is it not? And you would want to know that about a country before you doomed it and damned it and said, well, let's just dispose of the whole thing and throw it away. This is why we have so much of a problem in education now because we're not teaching things now. So look, the reason I wanted you to see Yuri Bezmenov in the beginning there is because this is the practical side of Marxism. That's how it manifests itself. He was a product of the Soviet Union. And so what was their plan? They were going to come over here and they were going to poison our thinking by getting into the educational systems and higher education. And they were going to get into the mass media, and they were going to start spreading subversive ideas. Ideas that would cause us not to get along with each other. Ideas that would make us suspicious of each other. Oh, look, we're different. So I should be suspicious of you. You should be suspicious of me. And you shouldn't trust me. You should only hang with your own people, not people. And I should hang with my own people. And we should turn into these factions of warring groups in some sort of Hobbesian dystopian nightmare where nobody can get along and everybody is just fighting with each other for power. This is what this would have been the means to bring on some violent revolution. So when you see this Yuri Bezmenov talking about how the goal was to get over there and just basically poison people's minds with these academic theories and things that they would publish in the mass media, because that's how you reach the most people, right? If you can educate children with Marxist-Leninist ideas, which is precisely what we are doing and have been doing for some time, which is absolutely terrifying, then you are simply creating a brand new culture of people who are never going to respect the country. They're never going to fall in line and be like, oh, you know what, this is, some of them, it's rare though. You're creating a new ideology, which is anti-American. And that's what ideological subversion is all about. So if you want to know what Marxism actually looks like in practice today, and you want to define it, it's going to sound a little bit silly and too oversimplified, but I think if you think about it a little bit, it will make sense to you. What is Marxism? If you're looking at capitalism and you're looking at a free market economy and a Bill of Rights and individual personal liberties that are guaranteed in our Constitution, etc., what is Marxism? It's not that. That's what Marxism is. Whatever is not that. So whatever crazy subversive ideas are out there that are anti-American, that divide us, that would be an example of Marxism. Once you have that lens in front of you, it's easy to see everywhere. So we're in the middle of these gender wars, for example, right? We have a Supreme Court justice who cannot define what a woman is. She herself is a woman with children, and she can't define what a woman is. How does this happen? And I think the short answer is she knows very well what a woman is. And I'm not attacking her. I feel bad for her. I think it's terrible when you see someone like that who's been brought to that point where, you know, she's just expressing the views that have been baked into her, the superstructure, the ideological views. And it's not somebody who is thinking rationally anymore, right? Just like Yuri told us, even if I take them by force and I show them a concentration camp, they will refuse to believe it. They won't believe it. And so it gets us into these traps. It gets us bogged down. Now we're wasting time having arguments over how do we define gender and what is biological sex versus gender identity. We have a whole new category for it, and we're coming up with a whole new set of rights for people who identify as different genders. And you know what? Is there some small point to be made there? Because there are people out there who could perhaps use a hand in getting ahead or to not be stomped on. You bet. But is it a major crisis that the whole nation should be focused on to the point where we're having wars with each other? I mean that metaphorically speaking, wars, and doing battle, and we're canceling each other out and refusing to let each other speak, and now people are so afraid to do so that they can't even say what they think a woman is. And what is the net result of that?